10:47 a.m. I heard the scissors before the room registered what they'd cut. It was a small, clean sound, two blades finding each other, and then a hollow click as the titanium token hit the stage floor and skittered away under the podium. For a single, suspended second, the auditorium held its breath. Then the lights winked, a green halo on the access console went dark, and the world I had spent 15 years building began to unwrite itself. They say the loud things stay in the memory. For me, it was the soft ones. The clatter of metal on wood, the whisper of a lanyard falling, the faint metallic chime of a sensor my back had felt as a weight lave my neck. Around me, people applauded. They thought they were witnessing a ribbon cutting. They were applauding a scalpel through our clearance. My name is Aerys Thorne. For a decade and a half, I lived in the margins of what people call the cloud, layers of human hands and steel racks and brown cardboard boxes and locked vaults, and I built one of those margins. I was the architect of a continuous hardware biometric tether, a system that treated access not as an event but as a conversation between person and machine. It was Class 7 level work, the kind of infrastructure that quietly kept billions in federal contracts accessible only to those who respected its discipline. It was not glamorous, it was ritual. People who hadn't lived inside that ritual thought of security like a padlock or a password. I thought of it as a religion of repetition, a daily checklist, a set of small physical acts that, in the aggregate, produce safety. There is a discipline to redundancy that feels religious if you worship at its altar long enough. You become fluent in the small private pieties, checking seals, confirming chain of custody, logging every key change with physical ink and witnesses. You learn that hardware has memory in ways people forget, and that the cloud behaves like a ledger you can only reconcile if you respect the handwriting. When the titanium hit the floor, the auditorium never had the chance to understand what it had applauded. The defensive choreography executed in a time measured less by heartbeats than by beats of a monitoring daemon, a shredding protocol, irreversible by design, that rendered certain datasets unreadable and almost as quickly triggered the administrative mechanisms that decertify a facility. Contracts that had lived under our roof for years were suspended, notices began to spool out to contracting officers, and a facility clearance that had been our corporate passport for federal work went from trusted to suspended in the span of a single breath. If you're watching this, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. If you've ever watched arrogance undo competence at work, subscribe and stay with me, because this story is as much about what an organization tolerates as it is about a single moment of hubris. The scissors were ceremonial. The scissors had been bought at a novelty shop and polished for effect. They smelled faintly of brass and fluorescent light. The man holding them was named Kieran Ashford, and he was the kind of person who expected ceremony to substitute for consequence. Kieran was the CEO's son. He had the easy smile of someone who had been assured the world bends for him, and the title, Vice President of Digital Innovation, that let him turn curiosity into policy. His presence reframed floors. Open concept furniture appeared. A mural of a rocket went up in the lobby, and the corporate newsletter began referring to disruption in celebratory italics. People who preferred caution became quiet. People who wanted promotion learned to applaud. His father, Lawrence Ashford, was all the things the campus brochure promised. Thoughtful investor, steady hand, a man who had taken a mid-tier defense contractor and, through years of acquisition and conservative bidding, made it indispensable. Lawrence believed in the company's original craft, not spectacle. He believed in discipline, and when pressed, in the people who made that discipline real. He also loved his son. That affection is not a trivial detail. Nepotism does strange work in organizations. It smooths the path for brilliance and dulls the teeth of skepticism. When a founder's hand leans toward indulgence, boundaries loosen. It's easier to say, give him a shot, than to square off with the son of the man who signs the checks. I did not come to this company as a believer in charisma. I came as someone who had been in the furnace. My first years were spent underground, not metaphorically. The vault where I cut my teeth was literal, a subterranean room with 12-inch concrete walls, a bank of servers that hummed like a distant hive, and a roster of engineers who treated the work like a craft. We moved slowly because we had to. We moved slowly because the systems we protected were unforgiving. There is a smell to those places, ozone and new plastic, the tang of soldered metal, and the old paper of manuals older engineers kept dog-eared. My token, the titanium pendant that lay now under the podium, was light but reassuring in the hand. I had it forged after an early failure. It bore tiny marks where the lanyard had scraped against concrete, a dent from a night when a courier had stumbled and mine had hit pavement. It was not a charm. It was a practice. In the morning, I would run its edge between my fingers, confirm its heartbeat against the meter, whisper the mundane checks that keep life out of the logbook. I learned to assume that anything promising speed would want to conserve the charm of speed at the expense of integrity. Move fast and break things is a fine motto when your primary loss is a prototype mobile app. It's criminally lazy as an operating principle for hardware on which classified material depends.
The tether system I designed operated on a straightforward professional principle: continuous affirmation. It required an embodied presence, biometrics paired with a hardware token, and persistent surveillance of contextual signals, answered by an architecture that refused to accept a single point of failure. There were contingencies layered upon contingencies. There were physical backups in distant vaults. There were tape archives in Utah older colleagues referred to with the kind of reverence usually reserved for family graves. We labeled them in handwriting and stored them in tamper-evident boxes. The cloud was a convenience. Our true resilience lived in paper, in human witnesses, in the arduous work of chain of custody documentation. When you have custody of classified work, you do not absolve yourself by pointing at services. You print memos, you notarize statements, you register witnesses in ink. I had learned that the hard way. There is no pride in not making mistakes. There is pride in making them unrepeatable. So when Kieran arrived with slides and a promise of transformation, I watched closely. His flagship was Project Velocity. The town hall was staged with the subtlety of a product launch: a giant screen, a filtered promo video of smiling employees, a slide palette of midnight blue and rocket flame. "We are going to move faster," Kieran said, smiling as if speed were an unalloyed good. "We will strip away the friction. We'll modernize. We'll make the company nimble again." The slides were full of metaphors: padlocks melting, chains falling, legacy systems replaced by a sleek interface that promised fewer clicks and more deals. He spoke in aphorisms that land well at shareholder meetings. He spoke of user experience and friction curves, and the applause came the way applause always does, from people who thought their bonuses might ride the wave. On the stage, I felt the old floors under my shoes, as if they were supporting a tectonic shift. Physically, nothing changed when he spoke, but I had spent enough time conversing with hardware to understand what was being asked. Reduced friction means fewer confirmations, fewer manual interventions, fewer people who can stop a cascade. To move fast in an environment designed for caution is to invite catastrophe in the flutter between a decision and its enforcement. I tried to keep my voice measured. I have spent my career explaining risk so that boards and executives can weigh it intentionally. After the presentation, I requested a meeting with Kieran and his inner team. Lawrence was present as well. You do not have the CEO without getting his attention. Jared Frey was in the room, his smile schooled but thin. Jared had been acting head of IT for a year and liked to keep his options open. Miriam Cole, our general counsel, sat with one leg crossed, a legal tablet open but unread, the way people who are used to seeing corporate choreography prefer to remain outwardly calm.
I laid out what Project Velocity would mean for our tether: fewer checkpoints, more ambient trust, and the elevation of convenience above ceremony. I did not use melodrama. I used scenarios. I parsed timeline impacts and flag points where a single human action could flip a state machine we had deliberately made hard to flip. I told them, plainly, without flourish, what would happen if the wrong person performed a symbolic act in front of an audience. Kieran smiled as if I were indulging him. "You're worried about symbols," he said, "but symbols are how culture changes. This isn't about tearing down security, it's about modernizing it." Lawrence watched me like a man deciding whether to trust his daughter's schoolteacher. I couldn't fault him for that. He loved his son and wanted to believe the son could shepherd the company into a new era. But loving someone does not erase technical causality, it only makes the argument more urgent. Jared interjected with the language of engineering agility. "There are ways to have rollback," he said. "We can build flags, we can set permissions, we can make a thing reversible." I call that conversation the private meeting because it was, but it was also a performance boundary. In corridors, in smaller rooms, people speak differently than in the auditorium. In smaller rooms, you can hear the subtext: how much someone wants a promotion, how much someone wants to be liked by the boss's son. In smaller rooms, cowed people trade professional patience for career mobility. Reversible in the abstract sounds warming. In the architecture of access, reversibility is a hazard if it's too easy. Some controls exist precisely to be irreversible, to make any mistake self-limiting. I said as much. I warned that any mechanism that simplified the act of severance for the sake of show would also simplify the act of severance, by mistake, by calculation, or by malice. I did not say you will burn us. I said this will decertify us. Decertify, like how long? Kieran asked, in that tone that asks the economist question before considering the moral one. I did not give him a promise. I gave him probabilities and costs. Months, audits, a suspension of clearance, an immediate shrinkage of revenue from federal clients. Not a sentence, not a guarantee. That language does not make for theatrical TV. It is slow and methodical and maddening to executives who want to see neat numbers and quick fixes. Miriam crossed her fingers slightly and looked down at a clause in her tablet. She was not yet ready to take a public stand. Lawrence shifted in his chair, eyes flicking between son and engineer. Jared's eyes held another calculation. He had been sitting in a middle ground for years, moving between the urgency of operations and the seduction of being the person who could deliver transformation. When you have one foot in each world, your mind becomes nimble enough to believe the nimble thing is always right.
In that meeting, he said something I will not forget. If it comes down to it, we can override the alert. The sentence was small, but the room stretched around it like a film strip. Every risk engineer knows the word override. Overrides are sometimes necessary, sparingly. They are also the thin edge of entropy. To create a plausible override path is to create a way for the improbable to become reality. Jared did not mean harm. He meant rescue. He meant a way to keep a ceremony from becoming a catastrophe. But a single gate that can be opened to stop inaction becomes, almost by definition, a liability. I remember where I sat in the room then. I remember the coffee on the table starting to condense at the lip of the cup. I remembered Marcus, our longtime security guard, standing by the door with that posture old sentries adopt, present but not invasive, the human hinge of an architecture that prefers living witnesses to algorithmic confidence. Marcus had been a presence for years. He knew our building's rhythms and had watched the company accrete layers of new corporate language over the old practical rituals. After the meeting, I did what I always do when I am given an impossible choice. I prepared for an autopsy. Not because I planned conflict, but because you cannot be a good custodian without preparing for an inquiry. I documented, I printed, I stamped. That documentation was simple, physical work. I wrote memos that did not beg or plead. They stated facts. What architectural invariants existed, what risks Project Velocity introduced, and the steps, legally and operationally, that would be required to mitigate those risks. I dated the pages. I signed them. Then I took them to be notarized. In the world of digital keys, ink is still a stubborn proof. The notary was a woman with a small, creased face who looked at the papers and at me as if she understood the difference between theatrical gestures and the slow, banal work of keeping systems honest. She stamped each page with a seal that carries no power beyond its performative weight, and yet performative weight matters when the alternative is plausible deniability. Ink and seal change the texture of responsibility. They make choices tangible. I put copies in a safe deposit box. I left a bound copy with one of our senior engineers, Mark, who had been with me in the bunker. He understood signatures because he'd been asked to sign the same forms in other companies and seen what happens when no one can prove they weren't. I also put sealed tapes, not the operational keys themselves, not anything that could be misused, but backups of configuration states in a recorded human-readable form, wrapped, labeled, and scheduled for storage in a vault aptide state lines. Folks in my line of work talk about the Utah tapes with the same dry reverence you might reserve for a cathedral's foundation. They are a place for evidence, a place where the past lies inert until human hands ask for it. I knew that documentation would not prevent a symbolic act. It would not stop a scissors held for show. But documentation is deterrence, and deterrence matters because it alters the incentives for plausible actors and for later investigations. If someone chooses spectacle over consequence, the record should reflect the choice. I am not naive about the limits of paper. I am also not naive about human memory. The engineer who sees the signatures will remember. The notary who stamps the forms will become a witness if the month comes that an auditor wants to know who knew what and when. These are small, slow defenses that do not flash on a PowerPoint. They are the scaffolding of credibility. In the weeks before the town hall, Project Velocity acquired momentum. There were advisory committees, design sprints, and late-night decks. There was also a culture shift in the engineer corridors, a low hum of people wanting to be on the winning side. Some of the younger staff loved the idea of fewer constraints. It made them feel like innovators rather than custodians. Some of the older staff watched with a kind of quiet grief, like seeing a tradition being renovated into a museum. At a private dinner, Lawrence took me aside. He wanted to hear it from me, without the performance of Jared's optimism or Kieran's charm. For a man used to betting on safe returns, he asked direct questions. "Do you think they understand the danger?" he asked. The question was never about technical specifications. It was about whether the people around him could translate immediate excitement into long-term stewardship. I told him the truth I always give. When culture values spectacle and speed over restraint, systems that require restraint will be at risk. He seemed to hear me, and then the phone on his table lit up with his son's name. He hesitated, then answered, and the conversation shifted. Love is not a failsafe. After the dinner, I wrote another memo. I did more than one. I printed a clean version, another for the file, and a third to leave with Miriam, with a note asking the legal team to formalize the warnings. Miriam's response came in measured tones, heavy on the legal possibilities and light on moral imperatives. Her inbox is the place where caution becomes clauses. She wrote back with a list of things she would require before putting a public sign-off to any modernization: explicit waiver of old contract clauses, the involvement of external auditors for change control, and an indemnity matrix.
The list was practical. It was also a plea. And still, the show went on. Kieran's office began to field requests for a ceremonial demonstration of Project Velocity, something that would dramatize breaking with the old in front of the staff. It would be an image for shareholders, a photograph for the press, a story of rebirth. He wanted it staged with all the simplicity of a ribbon cutting. The scissors were ordered. The prop team polished them until they shone.
I argued against a public demonstration. I asked for a technical dry run that excluded production systems and an executive walkthrough of the rollback protocols in the presence of legal counsel and independent auditors. The request was framed as procedural. It was dismissed as friction. "We need to send a message," Kieran said. "We have to let the company see what the future looks like." On my desk, the titanium token sat in a shallow dish of felt. I found in those days that my hands would seek the edge of worn metal when I was anxious. The token bore the story of my career in small scratches. Each one meant a night on call, a missed holiday, a midnight patch. It felt like a talisman and like a responsibility. I told myself that my duty was not to stop progress, but to keep the company intact enough to progress in good faith. That fidelity looks like resistance when the only voice in the room is the loudest one. The first time someone described my system as legacy, a word that tends to carry both respect and contempt, it felt like a poke. But legacy is not a moral slur. It is a category that means durability, continuity, and yes, age. When the young and showy define themselves against legacy, they often omit one simple truth. Legacy systems are the ones that worked. They accrued weight precisely because they resisted the seduction of novelty. One night I found Jared at an after-hours whiteboard session. He was drawing a flow I recognized too well, a half mechanism for a graceful rollback. He asked me if I thought they could implement a human-in-the-loop override that would let executives pause a rollout during a demo. I told him the truth. You cannot invent a reliable override ad hoc and expect it to behave predictably under stress. He pressed, "What if we constrain it? What if we limit it with checks?" I leaned back and looked at the sketched flow, at the circles labeled off and flag. The language was intentionally generic, not because Jared was hiding anything, but because this was a design scribble in a room full of people who thought shapes could substitute for constraints. Constraint only works if it is enforceable when the person who needs it is not. I said, human sympathy is not an engineered control. He nodded like a man who had wanted to be convinced. He wasn't convinced. He wanted to believe in the possibility of a rescue mechanic. I could see why. Engineers like Jarrett like to be the ones who build the rope for the people who fall. That is a noble instinct misapplied in a context where the fall would take a whole company with it. When the rehearsal schedule landed in my inbox, an invitation, politely phrased, my chest tightened. The rehearsal was a week before the town hall. They wanted me to be there. They wanted me to be cooperative. They wanted the optics of acceptance.
I RSVP'd with my professional availability and wrote a private note to Miriam asking her to attend in case the rehearsal involved production systems. She replied that corporate counsel would do what was necessary and asked I reserve comments for the formal debrief. I began, in quiet, to assemble witnesses into a lattice of testimony. I asked Marcus to be present in the rehearsal rooms and to note who accessed what consoles. I asked Mark to sit in with me. I made sure that copies of my memos were stored in different places, that some of the engineers I trusted had sealed notes assigning responsibility. None of this was theatrical. It was, at its core, a ledger. Who had been warned, when, and how. No one likes to prepare for a disaster they hope will not arrive. It feels uncharitable, pessimistic, or impertinent to assume someone will light a match with a crowd watching. But responsibility is not about hope. It is about preparing for the consequences of choices. The rehearsal came. The auditorium smelled faintly of stage makeup and stale coffee. Lights were low and technicians moved like a second orchestra. Kieran arrived with a charm smoothed for public viewing. He made a short, sharp speech about innovation and the future. There were cameras. There were smiling staffers with plastic badges. I watched him hold the scissors for a while, the way a magician holds a prop before a trick. He raised them for a gesture, and the titanium token, mine, which I had chosen not to wear that day as an act of distance from ceremony, went missing from my neck only in symbol. He lifted the scissors and laughed as if the joke were shared by everyone. He drew the blades toward the cord and paused. Something in me did not pause. It moved. "Stop," I said. The word was procedural, not hysterical. It was not shouted. It landed in the room with the same weight as a verbal seal. People looked at me as if I had interrupted a performance. Kieran blinked like a man surprised not by the question, but by the dissonance of a voice that would not be complicit in spectacle. "You cannot do this in production," I said. "Not here, not like this."
He smiled the smile of a man who thinks he is being reasonable. "We're doing a symbolic sever," he said. "We can demo the effect. It'll be staged." "Symbolic to whom?" I asked. "To shareholders? To PR agencies? The architecture doesn't care about your symbolism. It reacts to state." Someone laughed awkwardly. Jared muttered something about a quick patch. A technician adjusted a mic. Lawrence looked uneasy. I could feel the room weighing options. It is astonishing sometimes how quickly the social gravity of a boardroom can collapse resistance. The charisma of an event eats the edges of caution. I do not believe in theatrical confrontation. I believe in documentation and witnesses. I believe in making the record so heavy that casual disregard becomes expensive.
So I walked to the podium, picked up the titanium token from an assistant's hand where it had been placed after being removed for the rehearsal, and held it up without drama. My fingers found familiar nicks. I set it down carefully on the lectern, and then asked for a minute to state in plain terms what would otherwise be a private technical warning. I told them, again, what the architecture required, and why a ceremonial act in production was a category error. I asked for a rehearsal on an isolated testbed. I asked for legal presence. I asked that the demonstration be symbolic without touching the tethering hardware. The ask was modest, professional, and entirely reasonable. Kieran's face tightened, not with anger, but with a kind of incredulity. "You're asking me to curtail a symbol for fear of bureaucracy?" he said. "I'm asking you to respect the system we secured for the clients who pay our bills," I said. "A ceremony that touches the system risks more than reputation. It risks contracts and livelihoods." The technician's headphones clicked in the quiet, a human tick, and someone in the back of the room shifted in their seat. Jared was looking at me with an expression I could not easily read, embarrassed perhaps that this had come to a public halt, fearful perhaps that he had miscalculated the simplicity of the solution he had imagined. There are moments when a room must choose what it values. The choice is rarely explicit. It's made through inaction as much as action. The rehearsal ended with a compromise. The technical team would show a simulated sever on a testbed. The props would not touch the system. Kieran accepted with a theatrical bow. The press and shareholders would get their images. We would not officially touch the live tether. That compromise in engineering is called mitigation, a temporary fix that reduces risk without eliminating it. Sometimes mitigation works. Sometimes it is a lull in a larger storm. After the rehearsal, I stayed late. The auditorium emptied, and the night crew began to power down lights. In the dim aisle, Marcus found me and handed me my token. He had picked it up earlier before anyone could exploit a lapse in attention. His fingers were rough and smelled of tobacco. His posture was exactly as it had been the day I first met him. Matter of fact, no flourish. "Keep it close," he said. "You'll want it tomorrow." "I will," I said. I took home the token in my pocket. I slept poorly. The small private rituals of caretaking do not soothe entirely when you suspect an institutional choice is about to become a public crisis. The token was small comfort. The memos and notarized pages were larger ones. They were the architecture of being right before you might be called to account. In the days that followed, small things began to happen that set the scene for what would become the auditorium cut. There were offhand jokes in Slack channels about cutting the cord.
There were promotional emails about the new Ashford era. There were pictures of Kieran with a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors, smiling like a mayor about to open a new park. The narrative had moved from "we will modernize" to "we will break with the past" in the public mind, while my team and I watched the difference between metaphor and mechanism narrow. I kept documenting. I kept witnesses close. I asked Mark to annotate logs and to print them to a secure file in case anything needed corroboration. I asked Sarah and other engineers to keep a low-profile copy of configuration snapshots, not to be activated or used for anything but evidence. It felt like preparing for a trial in which the defendants were absent. When the day arrived and the auditorium filled, people cheered for reasons that were partly sociological, to be part of the movement, and partly personal, to be seen as on the right side of history. The smile economies in organizations are complicated. Some people applaud for status, others applaud because they genuinely want a better future. I cannot remember a time when both together felt like such a flammable mix. I stood in the wings and watched Kieran walk on stage. He grinned, lifted the scissors as if in benediction, and looked directly at the CEO. Lawrence, who had been handsome and weary, offered a thin, encouraging clap. The room leaned forward the way a body leans toward a story it wants to enjoy. At 10:47 a.m., a small sound made a large aftershock. The token fell. The light went out. The protocol answered in a way systems are designed to do: instant, irrevocable, efficient. It did not consider intent or ceremony. It considered state and acted upon it. I heard the whisper of the sensors as if through wet cotton.
The technician's headset hissed perception into silence. Jared made a sound in the back of the stage, half shock, half calculation. Miriam's phone buzzed against her thigh. Lawrence's face registered a slow, uncomprehending panic, the kind of betrayal that comes when love and consequence collide in public. I walked off the stage without theatrics. I did not need to shout to be heard. My silence had weight. I had done the quiet work of documenting, notarizing, and placing witnesses. I would need those things now more than ever. But the room had witnessed a spectacle, the CEO's son severing the token of access, and in doing so, the company cutting its own diplomatic cable to a branch of federal work that relied on our certified posture. Behind the immediate physics of the cut, there were the bureaucratic beats. Automated notices that had been sitting in idle scripts now fired into life, sending messages to contracting officers and auditors that an event had occurred which by policy triggers decertification. The language of those notices was clinical. It did not contain blame. It contained status changes and procedure references. But procedure can be destiny.
The protocol had been written to avoid ambiguous human judgment in crisis. It had been written to execute without partiality. It had done its job. What remains after the moment is often the slow work of human interaction, phone calls that start with quiet disbelief, then rise into urgent questionings, legal counsel issuing notices of suspension, executives scrambling to fashion narratives, engineers opening logs to understand the what and not the who, security guards like Marcus standing at doors as if the building were both body and witness. I walked into the corridor where the press had not yet been allowed and saw Jared staring at his hands. He had been complicit in imagining a rescue path. He had not imagined the system would do exactly what it was designed to do when the conditions were met. The company began to fold inward. People who had been quick to cheer were now quiet, walking in small clusters, being told what little was known and asked not to speculate. A protocol that had been a point of pride suddenly looked like a cliff. The same architecture that had protected us had built in a criterion for self-preservation that did not negotiate. In the space of a few minutes, we had moved from performance to paralysis. I left the campus that afternoon with work on my phone and a box of paperwork in the passenger seat. The box had my notarized memos, sealed copies of logs, and printed snapshots of configuration states, the artifacts that, in the coming days, would matter more than any statement from a PR team. I did not run. I did not storm the boardroom. I was not a martyr on stage. I was, as always, trying to leave an auditable trail. Outside in the parking lot, a line of cars waited under the afternoon sun. There were people in suits and people in hoodies, employees and contractors who had just watched what they thought would be a celebratory moment become the moment their paychecks might be in jeopardy. I drove home slowly. On the dashboard, the titanium token was a small cold weight under the seatbelt click. I felt like someone carrying a history. In the days ahead, the work would become granular. Phone calls to federal contracting officers, emails to auditors, a PR team trying to write a statement that both acknowledged an incident and did not admit negligence, Miriam crafting legal shields while also trying to learn the truth. There were questions that would wind around the company like ivy. Who authorized the demonstration? Who attended the private rehearsals? What did Jared understand when he spoke of overrides? And how did the chain of custody look when measured against law and policy? I had prepared for the possibility of an autopsy. I had not prepared for the immediate personal experience of having one's career reduced in the public eye to a scene. The world loves a ritual. The ribbon cutting, the launch. The world also loves a scapegoat. I did not intend to be either.
The first 48 hours after the cut were a blur of terse phone calls, automated notices, and a small but escalating leak of internal commentary to journalists who always know how to find the smell of a crisis. Staff began to report being contacted by third parties. Murmurs in engineering channels suggested people were being asked to hold statements. The company issued a carefully worded press release that spoke of an operational incident during a demonstration and full cooperation with appropriate authorities. It was true, but it was also a text shaped to keep worst-case interpretations at bay. And so the scene moved from an auditorium to the quieter, procedural world where the future of a company is decided. Board meetings, council briefings, insurance assessments, and the kind of minutia that eats headlines, timelines, logs, witness statements. The ceremonial nature of the act did not unmake the protocol's design. It made the protocol's effect inevitable. I will tell you more of what followed, the way the federal contracting side reacted, the months of audit and negotiation, the retrieval of tapes from Utah, and the arduous work of trying to piece together what could and could not be recovered. I will tell you how competence and restraint, the virtues of my trade, confronted the energy of showmanship, and how human institutions respond when their safeguards do what they are built to do, protect. Lawrence moved through the crisis like a man who had been asked to hold two truths at once: love for his son and fiduciary responsibility to a company that employed thousands. There were moments when his gaze found mine in the boardroom, and we shared a look that was not accusation, but the barren solidarity of people who must fix what they love. In private, he was contrite. In public, he was measured. He had, in the end, to do the arithmetic of survival. That arithmetic is rarely neat. Jared disappeared from public view almost immediately, not because he was a villain, he never felt like one to me, but because operational trust is fragile, and once broken, becomes expensive to maintain. He was placed under administrative restriction pending an internal review. His name in later memos became an administrative footnote rather than a headline. People who had been eager to believe in his agility now had to reconcile the cost of that agility. I watched him at the edges of council meetings, a man who had tried to build a rope and found it may have become noose-like in the wrong hands. Complexity does not excuse responsibility, it complicates it. There were phone calls I will not recount for drama, but for their relentless sameness. Contractors calling to ask whether ongoing work would be affected, clients asking for a plain statement about risk, auditors asking for logs and chain of custody artifacts. The language of these conversations was dry and judicial. People wanted to know what to bill and what to stop. The week after the cut felt like a severance of trust measured in purchase orders. We went into triage mode. Miriam and I agreed that transparency, as far as our counsel would allow, was the best defensive posture. There is a moral calculus in incidents like this. Obfuscation invites legal jeopardy and practical panic. Candor invites scrutiny, but preserves the possibility of cooperation. We chose candor, and submitted a stack of documents. The notarized memos, the logs Mark had printed, the sealed snapshots Sarah had made. Those artifacts were small things: paper, ink, tape labels, but they had been chosen because they did not evaporate in the way ephemeral Slack messages do. Federal auditors arrived in waves over the next month. They wore the anonymous professionalism of bureaucrats who know how to make small hands feel large. Clipboards, checklists, slow, patient questions about chain of custody and change control. Their queries were not about blame in the way a journalist frames blame. They were about conformity to standards that are often excruciatingly granular. Did we follow change control? Who signed off on rehearsal parameters? Who had authority to touch production? The answers were in our stacks. The answers were also in gray areas, verbal assurances, cultural nudges that did not translate easily into compliance checkboxes. A narrative began to leak externally, as narratives do.
Internal comments slipped to journalists who specialize in technology and security. There were quotes, unnamed, pointed, about a corporate culture that confused PR for engineering. Headlines ran with the imagery of scissors and severed tokens. PR tried to finesse those stories into a neutral release about an operational incident during a demonstration. That wording was technically accurate and emotionally evasive. It did not say the word most people wanted, decertification. But the industry knew what the automated notices had already stated in bureaucratic shorthand. Certification had been suspended. One of the things people outside our world do not understand is how fast a market relationship collapses after a federal clearance is lost. Contracts are not just legal documents, they're bets based on trust. When a company loses the credential that proves it's trustworthy in the bureaucratic sense, the bets are called in, contingencies activated, and revenues start to look different. We saw stop work orders. We saw the quiet, small cancellations that do not merit a press release but make a payroll gap painfully visible. In the second week, an offer came across my desk that I had expected but hoped would not. The board spelled out a negotiation. They wanted an expert to lead a remediation effort and manage communications with auditors. They wanted a public narrative that assured clients they were in hands that understood the issue. They offered the old incentives: a formal title, resources, and a mandate to rebuild. I had, from the day the token hit the stage, one bargaining chip that mattered more than a title: the documents and witnesses I had placed in safekeeping. I set terms that were exacting and practical. I refused to be a figurehead. I insisted on authority and independence. I demanded indemnity for actions taken in good faith to rebuild. I requested the involvement of independent auditors as gatekeepers to any recertification process, and a clause that protected anyone from retaliation if they cooperated fully. Those conditions are procedural but not petty. They were meant to create work that could stand up to scrutiny. Miriam and I pushed those terms in rooms thick with lawyers and board members. There was resistance, some of it bureaucratic, some of it personal, but the arithmetic of survival made the board willing to sign commitments. In exchange for my oversight role, they required a public statement that acknowledged the operational incident and promised remediation. The statement was awkward, balanced on the edge between legal conservatism and the storytelling that clients wanted. It acknowledged the incident without assigning malice. It promised cooperation. It framed the company as committed to integrity.
The negotiation was not moral grandstanding, it was practical leverage.
I used the credibility of my documentation to insist on a roadmap that included external audits, non-repudiation of process steps, and an assurance that the people charged with remediation would have the authority to build a system that respected the old constraints, rather than dismantling them for spectacle. The board accepted. The agreement was signed. I was given a small team and a string of vendor contacts. The work that would follow had nothing to do with heroics. It involved procurement requests, tape manifests, climate control logs, and lots of paperwork people thought they'd left behind in the last century. The physical recovery began with the Utah tapes. The phrase Utah tapes became a kind of private liturgy in our team. It meant going to the place where we had stored human-readable evidence of configuration states, magnetic tapes, printed manifests, tamper-evident boxes. It meant relying on old-school, deliberate processes that the digital world often discards. Those tapes smelled of dust and mineral air. They moved with a physicality that humbles anyone raised on streaming. We flew a skeletal crew to the vault. The drive-in was quiet. Vast, low hills cut the sky. The vault itself was a place where the atmosphere was engineered to be forgettable. You don't want the storage to be dramatic. You want it to be boringly reliable. The technician who greeted us in the sorting room had an expression like a man who knew he would be measured by the ease with which he could find small things in a large, indifferent archive. Loading tapes is a ritual. Gloves, labels checked 3 times, readers warmed up. Each reel is a promise. It contains something someone once thought important enough to write down with ink and index with human labor. Not everything on those tapes would be useful. Some artifacts are, as the protocol intended, irretrievably down. Cryptographic shredding had made certain bits unreadable. That reality was reflected in the grim, quiet faces of the team when some readers returned only metadata, timestamps and file indexes, but no readable payload. But the tapes were not all ash. They contained configuration snapshots, human-readable logs, and near copies of paperwork we had preserved. We reconstructed state diagrams from those artifacts. We found the notations Mark had left in the margins of printed logs and reconnected them to timestamps. We built, in slow, painstaking increments, a map of what could be reconstituted. There were nights in the vault where the work felt near-surgical. Engineers took shifts, coffee cooling at their elbows, fingers stained with printer ink rather than code. The atmosphere was neither romantic nor cinematic. It was practical, painstaking, and often lonely. Conversations were short and precise. People compared notes in the clipped language of tradespeople who have to measure twice and cut once. Partial recoveries allowed us to reconstruct enough of the platform to create testbeds.
These testbeds were sterile by design. They were stripped of production data and used only to verify reinstallation and recertification steps. We monitored error rates and built processes that could, in principle, be audited. The goal was not to replicate exactly what had been lost, but to reestablish a posture that would satisfy federal auditors, demonstrable chain of custody, independent attestations, and a system that did not reward spectacle over ceremony. I cannot tell you the exact hours of that work without sounding like I'm cataloging misery. It involved hundreds of person days, nights moving pallet boxes, days poring over brittle printouts, meetings across time zones. We had a small, talented crew, Mark, Sarah, and a handful of engineers who had remained when many left, and they showed up with the kind of steady, resigned competence that made me proud in a way adrenaline never could. There were layoffs, inevitable and cruel. When revenues contract and certs take months, a company must make painful choices. I sat in those meetings and watched names become spreadsheet entries. People who had been our friends and colleagues were told with careful, human kindness where possible that their positions were no longer tenable. Many of those layoffs were technical staff in positions that could not be sustained without the contracts that had been suspended. There were private apologies, offers of severance, and promises of introductions. Those promises helped, but only a little. Watching people you respect leave is a forwarding of grief into practical loss. It is also, in the calculus of corporate survival, the difference between survival and insolvency. The cultural work of repair took far longer than the technical work. Policies alone cannot heal the reputational wound of a public ritual gone wrong. We instituted stronger channels for dissent, anonymous reporting routes, formal change control sign-offs with independent observers, and requirements that any demonstration touching production must have explicit joint authorizations from legal, security, and an external auditor. None of these reforms were glamorous. They were functionally what we should have had to begin with. As we reassembled the platform on the testbeds, auditors, some federal, some independent, came in and out. They took temperature logs, asked about notarizations, and compared our newly constructed processes to regulation. There was no applause in these rooms. There were only the exacting nods of people whose job is to break arguments so the durable parts remain.
They would not give us a certificate because we ask for it. They would give it when our work met standards. That standard-based humility is the most useful posture a company can have when the world they serve asks for predictable stewardship. During the months of rebuilding, the company leadership changed. Boards are pragmatic.
A board that oversees a company trying to survive a suspension of clearance cannot comfortably accommodate the forces that precipitated that suspension. Lawrence remained on the board, but his role shifted from operational presence to steward in the background. He accepted, with more dignity than I expected, that his son's enthusiasm had outstripped the discipline the work required. Kieran, for his part, was moved into a role with fewer direct technical authorities. The company did not excommunicate him, it reallocated him. The message from the board was clear. Spectacle could no longer be currency for decisions about systems people lived behind. There was a cheaper, human moral in the way people behaved during the rebuild. Those who had been quiet before rose to the work. Engineers who had been content to nod at town halls returned to their trade with a humility that had a kind of grace. The younger staff who had once sought the sparkle of disruption learned the less charismatic virtues of repetition and custody. That change was not universal. Culture never flips like a light switch. But the work of rebuilding required a slow, steady re-education in how to value small acts over big gestures. Months into the remediation, our auditors reported back in careful language. We had satisfied a series of criteria for partial recertification in sandboxed environments and were recommended for full audit. The language was cautious. They insisted on more proof, more time. I welcomed it. Audit is not a barrier to innovation. It is the scaffolding that allows innovation to persist under the weight of real-world consequences. During one late-night review, Miriam sat across from me in a fluorescent-lit conference room and for the first time since the cut, allowed a softer tone. "You made it possible for us to answer the who knew when question," she said. "That's how you survive a crisis like this, by making sure the record is not just someone's memory." Her words were not a celebration of vindication. They were an acknowledgement that our small acts, ink, witnesses, tapes, had bought us something, the ability to be heard by people whose code of judgment is paperwork and procedure. The point of discipline is not to win arguments, it is to survive audits. There were moments of human grace in the aftermath. Marcus, the security guard, who had been quiet in the ceremonial storm and steady in the nights that followed, became the kind of witness nobody writes about in press releases. He kept logs in a neat, unassuming ledger that, when presented, became a piece of evidence about who had been present in certain rooms at certain times. He received, in private, a modest bonus for his time and care. He declined media attention. "I do my job," he told me once. "I lock the doors and I remember faces." That is the sort of dignity that does not make headlines but makes systems livable. As remediation continued, offers started to trickle in.
Not the sensational kinds that make newspaper columns, but practical work, consulting engagements from companies who wanted to learn from our mistakes, speaking requests at security conferences, and cautious inquiries from federal agencies interested in institutional knowledge. I declined some offers and accepted others on my terms. I would not, I said, be a token or a spectacle. I would consult in ways that allowed me to insist on the slow machinery of proof. One offer lingered, a conversation with a government office that had been an occasional client. They were practical and understated. They wanted someone who had built a system, witnessed its failure in the public eye, and learned the hard lesson of procedural liturgy. They wanted a consultant who could help design policy and training around the interface of technology and ceremony. We spoke carefully about non-disclosure and the limits of what I could offer. There was no dramatic oath of service. There was, instead, a steady acceptance that my career would have another chapter. Less about building walls and more about teaching how to keep those walls from being mistaken for stage sets. I accepted an advisory role under terms that preserved my independence. I would not become a permanent civil servant, and I would not trade the messy freedom of private practice for a bureaucratic title. I felt in those months more interested in building institutional habits than in collecting credentials. My new work was slow, methodical, and gratifying in a way adrenaline never had been. I taught auditors how to read configuration scars. I taught boards what a notarized memo looks like in practice. I watched young engineers realize that their craft returned them to a place where their competence mattered more than their charisma. There were consequences that never fully evaporated. Some contracts were permanently lost. Some clients had shifted to other vendors who could offer immediate coverage. People who had left for greener pastures did not return. The company that emerged afterward was leaner, quieter, and for better or worse, more respectful of custodial ritual. There was a new slate of policies and a new language in the employee handbook about demonstrations and production systems that read like common sense if common sense had been neglected. I had asked during negotiation for one final term, a public acknowledgement of the institutional mistakes that allowed spectacle to threaten safety. The board resisted, at first, for legal reasons. Public mea culpas are dangerous and rare. We compromised on something less theatrical, a joint statement acknowledging lessons learned and announcing a set of procedural reforms, with an independent audit to be published when complete. The wording was forensic but not ignoble. It did not call names.
It called attention to the array of minor failures: cultural indulgence, lax change control, insufficient external controls that had conspired to allow a symbolic act to have real-world consequences. A few months later, when the independent auditor's report was released, it read like a manual of hard-won humility. They did not name personal failings. They cataloged process gaps and recommended a set of binding, auditable controls. It was not an exoneration of any individual's motives. It was, instead, an instruction manual for avoiding the next ritualized disaster. For me, that felt like enough. The years that followed were quieter. I continued to consult. I worked with government and private firms alike, building training programs, advising on how to embed consent and independence in demonstrations, and championing rituals that prioritize human witnesses over photo ops. I do not think I am a hero. I think I'm a professional who happened to be present when the job needed doing, and used the tools that had been working long before anyone thought viral images mattered more than system integrity. Lawrence and I met once after the work had largely concluded. He was older than when we had first crossed paths, and he carried an exhaustion that had nothing to do with time zones or meetings. We spoke quietly, like two people who had shared a near accident and were now sorting out how to live with the scars. He did not offer excuses. He offered a short thank you and a handshake that was not theatrical. The kind of reconciliation we had was not grand. It was practical and sincere. Kieran's arc was not a morality play. He did not vanish into ignominy, nor did he become a villain in a storybook. Instead, his responsibilities were reshaped. He was removed from direct oversight of production systems and assigned to a role where his appetite for change could be funneled into product thinking rather than into ceremonies that touched fragile states. There was a lesson there about the architecture of accountability. People can be redirected. In the public imagination, the story remained simple. The CEO's son cut the cord, and the company paid. In truth, what happened was more complex and instructive. The protocol did exactly what it should have done: enforce the state it was given without regard to intention. That quality is a virtue in security. It avoids subjective judgments in moments of crisis. The human failure was not the existence of a token, or even the existence of scissors. It was the cultural elevation of a performative moment over the sober demands of custody. I tell that to audiences now with a kind of disciplined bluntness. Showmanship and spectacle have their place. They are good for fundraising and headlines. But there is a moral economy in infrastructure. Small acts repeated matter more than a single loud gesture. That is the lesson I try to carry forward in my work and in my conversations with boards and teams.
There are procedural lessons too. Never equate the optics of a demonstration with the health of a system. Treat demonstrations that touch production like surgical procedures. Have a sterile protocol, witnesses, legal presence, and independent verification. These are not theatrical directions. They are the architecture of survival. When I meet young engineers at conferences, they often ask what to do when the loud voice in the room insists on cutting ribbons. I tell them the same thing I did in that auditorium. Document, witness, notarize. Those are not tactics for vengeance. They are safeguards that make later investigations legible. Preserve evidence. Build human rituals that matter as much as software roles. That is how institutions become resilient. The final chapter of the company's remediation included a cautious recertification process, not a celebratory badge, but a measured return to productive work under watchful external verification. Some contracts returned, some values shifted. The organization that emerged was not the same as the one that had cheered for spectacle. It was, in some ways, better for the humility that crisis imposes, if humility is allowed to rebuild culture rather than be used as a cudgel. My own professional life did not end with one company's recovery. It expanded into a role of advisor and teacher. I took assignments that allowed me to formalize procedures into manuals and trainings. I sat on panels where I made the case for things nobody likes to sell: notarized memos, redundant human witnesses, and the low, unspectacular virtue of restraint. I did not enjoy the spotlight. I enjoyed the work that made systems less vulnerable to the sort of social temptation that had sent a token skittering across a stage. If you wonder whether the cut was justice or tragedy, the answer is both. Systems did what we trained them to do. People did what we trained them, some to be careful, some to be bold in ways that were misapplied. No single person owned the failure.
It was a tapestry of indulgence, misjudgment, and institutional weakness. That is the unpleasant truth of many corporate breakdowns. My last public engagement with the company was perfunctory and short. I handed over the final remediation report to the board in a meeting that was businesslike. I accepted the consulting retainer I had negotiated, heavier on accountability than on compensation. I left with a handshake from Lawrence that had none of the theatricality of the auditorium applause. It had sincerity. That was enough. In the end, what I keep telling people is simple. Competence is the quiet, unglamorous work that preserves potential. Noise and spectacle can accelerate careers, but they are poor substitutes for the slow labor that keeps systems alive. The token that fell that morning remains, in a drawer in my study, scored and familiar.
It is a small object that carries a lot of history. Nights in a vault, the smell of tempered metal, the weight of prudence. If you are in a room where speed is being used to justify diminished duty, ask who will be there to witness the autopsy if the worst happens. If you lead a team, insist on notarized records and independent verification when demonstrations touch production. If you are young and eager for the glow of disruption, learn the craft of custody. It will carry you longer than applause. This story is not a call for fear. It is an argument for steadiness. The obvious spectacle, scissors, ribbons, viral images, makes for a headline. The hard work, tapes in Utah, notarized memos, patient audits, makes for survival. In a world that admires the loudest voice, I have learned to admire the steady hand. If this account resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear what restraint looks like in practice. Like this video if you value competence over noise, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because these lessons matter in boardrooms and basements, in government offices and startup garages alike.